Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Gerber, editor of The Gathering Place and denominational minister for Christian Formation for Mennonite Church USA. And I am so excited to have Anna Groff here, who is the executive director of Dove's Nest this month for the Gathering Place webinar. Every month on the Gathering Place, we focus on a new theme. And this month, we are talking about sexual abuse prevention. And so it's wonderful to have Anna from the Dove's Nest here, who that is their agency's work is to help our congregations be safe and to be safe sanctuaries where sexual abuse prevention is a part of the congregational life. So welcome, Anna, to the Gathering Place. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you.
Well, why don't you go ahead and just jump in and get started. And if you have any introductory questions or whatever, feel free to call on us and we'll do our best to make this as interactive as possible.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. I'm sharing my screen with you all so you can see the PowerPoint. Dove's Nest we work with faith communities and churches, many in the Anabaptist tradition, but we really work with any denomination on keeping children and youth safe. Here's a bit about what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to do an overview with some terms on abuse terminology, what your church is probably already doing. We'll talk about healthy boundaries, touch, technology, and then I've got some discussion actually sprinkled throughout. So I'll probably go through the first part pretty quickly because I'm assuming a lot of you will already be familiar with this information regarding terminology, but it's good to have a review as well. So as Rachel said, today we're focusing on sexual abuse, but I wanted you to at least see the definitions for other types and know that actually neglect, which is there at the bottom, is the most common form of abuse, particularly with younger children. And so as churches, we do want to be aware, especially when it comes to reporting what we see or what a child or youth discloses, to also be aware of neglect, which would be the failure of a parent or a caregiver to provide things that the children needs. And this is more than just like forgetting a lunch. This would be a pattern of that kind of failure. Sexual abuse, unfortunately, is the most common in church settings. It's also the one that children and youth disclose the least, meaning it's the one that they keep the most secretive. And that's probably not a surprise to many of us. And you also see physical and emotional abuse. You're all seeing the types of abuse slide?
Yeah, it looks great.
Mm-hmm. Great, good. So there at the bottom is just some sort of scripture to keep us grounded and remember why this is so important and the mandate that we have as Christians to protect children and youth. Jeanette Harder, who's one of the co-founders of Dove's Nest, she wrote a book called Let the Children Come. And I think I have a slide on that at the end. And in there, she uses a lot of scripture and theology as really helpful reminders on why this needs to be a priority. How many of you are familiar with the book that Conrad Carnegie wrote, the Church Member Profile on Mennonite Church USA? Okay, I'm seeing heads nodding. That's great. So this information is 10 years old, but still really important. In Mennonite Church USA, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 20 men reported having experienced sexual abuse. And most of that abuse happened, particularly for women, before they were the age of 18. So when they were children or youth. I've heard lots of different numbers. I was just at a Mennonite Central Committee consultation on their campaign called We Will Speak Out Against Sexual Violence. And the definition of sexual violence that they're using is a lot broader than sexual abuse. And they're seeing, and the CDC has also used that same definition, and they're saying, 1 in 3 women have experienced sexual violence. And the little tiny survey that MCC did actually found 2 in 3 women have experienced sexual violence. I think some of that has to do with the small sample size and with the kind of people that were responding to that survey. But regardless, for some people, statistics are very convincing. For others, stories are convincing. And you might want to think through in your own church context what will help get the message across that this is important. But I wanted to at least provide these numbers for you, and you can kind of do your own digging too for your own state and local context. So this slide, sexual violence by adolescents. I talked with Rachel a little bit about this morning. A large number of child abuse cases are perpetrated by other children or youth. So I refer to this as adolescent on adolescent abuse. And Dove's Nest has received many calls this past year and earlier on this issue. So it would be like a 15-year-old abusing a 10-year-old or something like that. I'm looking for more information on this, and if any of you have seen helpful resources or handouts, let me know. We would want to approach this same kind of abuse with reporting it and going through an investigation with the authorities in the same way that it would be if the offender was an adult. But I do believe there are particulars, especially when you have the victim and offender families both attending the same church. And I imagine that's incredibly hard to navigate, and that's what I'm hearing from the pastors. We have one article on our website by Trudy Good, and she makes these 3 points about this issue. The one being how important Christian education and times in youth group and Sunday school are really important to create a culture of safety so that girls and boys are feeling safe around each other. One of the main themes that came out at this MCC consultation that I was at was the importance for men to be modeling and to be teaching boys positive masculinity or respect for women, however you want to say, talk about that. But that concept of men have to have ownership in this too. And I'm really glad to see Clayton involved on this webinar, and I'm sure more men will listen in as well. So I think MCC is actually going to think about developing some of those resources because there seems to be a real lack. Number 2 would be, Trudy uses the example of a lot of churches think, what could a 16-year-old girl possibly do wrong in a nursery? And that sort of naivete isn't helpful in addressing this issue. And then the last one is more about moving forward sort of after an investigation has taken place, and if there was illegal sexual behavior committed by a minor to another minor, how you would move forward as a church. And I won't get into a lot of detail there because it's fairly complex and specific to the situation. So this one, I'm sure you've thought about a lot of these. What churches can offer at the end of that bulleted list is attentive listening, which sounds cliche and you all know this, but I came across a really interesting peer-reviewed article that said that's one of the number one things that teens are saying they want from church is adults that listen to them. So I think that's huge, and I think it relates to healthy sexuality and abuse prevention. Then we've got this list of things that you've all thought about, I'm sure, but pushing for forgiveness. I think there's this need that a lot of Mennonites have to love the enemy or love the hardest person that is to love. And so we put so much focus on that when it comes to the offenders. And then we forget about victims and survivors in our midst and what they might need. So denial, trusting too much, trying to take care of it themselves, harboring offenders, expecting forgiveness, not implementing protection policies, and then the higher risk the environment, the higher the trust, which means it's easier to commit abuse. So believing a youth that comes to you is really important. Remembering that those false reports are incredibly rare. I just did a training with the Faith Trust Institute. Are you all familiar with Faith Trust Institute? They have some really excellent resources on this as well. The woman who founded that, Marie Fortune, she said that she's worked with over 1,000 churches regarding abuse, and she said only about 4 in over 1,000 turned out to be false allegations that were made up by the victim in that case, or not victim. So that really struck me, that I think since ministry is such an intimate thing, we are really wary of someone misinterpreting what we're doing, pastors and church leaders and lay leaders like myself. But it's helpful for us to be reminded that we're not more likely to be falsely accused. Here's a slide on grooming, and I really like this Safety Ever After website if you want to check it out. When we talk about grooming, I've sensed that churches get a little paranoid, or that kind of uptight feeling of, how do I show the children and youth that I love them and care for them without looking like I'm grooming them or getting too close or whatever? And I think it's important to remind people that healthy interactions are what we want. We just want them to take place in public spaces, and to be appropriate, and that affection can be appropriate and in the view of others. So grooming would be showing up constantly where the youth is to see them or spend time with them, trying to spend time alone with them, secrecy, things like that. So it's more than just reaching out to the children around you. Protection policy. How many of your churches have protection policies for children and youth? Okay. I would assume most. I'm finding that most churches that I talk to in MCUSA have a policy, or at least beginning to work on one. So that's been a real awesome growth area. What about Circle of Grace? Are any of you familiar with Circle of Grace, the safety curriculum? So Dove's Nest holds licenses for Mennonite Church USA congregations, and through a grant that we got years ago, we're able to give this curriculum out for free for Mennonite Church USA or related churches. So if you don't have it, let me know. And it goes up to grade 12 in Spanish and English. Stranger danger. After this slide is my first sort of question slide, so you might want to be thinking about how you want to respond. I'm in my 30s, and when I was growing up, this was big. So, be careful when you're trick-or-treating. Don't get into a stranger's car. Don't trust people you don't know, the creepy guy on the street. We are finding now that that is really unhelpful, because most kids and teens know the person who's hurt them and know them quite well. So someone in their family, church, neighborhood, community. Up to 90%, I've seen up to 95, 96%. So really, stranger danger is not a myth. Also, stereotypes of who would be a sex offender is also unhelpful. So I was wondering, especially in the realm of teens, what kind of messages do we hear as leaders, or do you think teens are hearing, that are reinforcing this myth of stranger danger? The one that I thought about it at my church was this notion that it's okay if a Mennonite voluntary service worker or a young adult that we know spends time with the teens because we know them, but someone that we don't know, we're much less likely to trust, and we want them to jump through the kind of hoops of background check and all that, or we take that more seriously. Do any of you have any other examples? And if not, that's fine. I just wanted to take a moment with this one. All right, I will move on. So these slides are from Faith Trust Institute. I want to make sure to give them proper credit. And I will, this is interactive here using a different part of our brain. So there's a series of images, and this is going to help us think about boundaries and healthy boundaries. I don't think I prefaced that very well, but you'll soon catch on. So a wide open field, that you can see forever and you see the sky. How does this make you feel? Just in 1 or 2 words. Tanya, can I call on you?
Sure. For me, that's a feeling of safe because I grew up and appreciate wide open space.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else react differently or the same?
I guess I look at it as feeling very peaceful, except the person in there, I mean, they have their back to me is how I'm seeing it. And so, I mean, I guess it's different if I'm the person or if I'm viewing that person, but I don't know who they are from this perspective. And I don't know if I'll interact with them. Maybe there's enough space between us that I don't have to, but those are the first kind of thoughts that come to my mind.
I like that. I've led this discussion with a few other groups, and I haven't heard anyone talk about whether or not that figure is representing yourself or someone else. So that's good. Some people say this is, freeing and peaceful and safe. Others say it's a little overwhelming. They don't know what's over the hill. They don't know, there's no structure. And people like Tanya have mentioned, it kind of depends on a little bit on where you're from, and that wide open space, if that's a comforting thing for you or not. All right, we've got 2 walls, a brick wall and the Berlin Wall. I'd like to add a photo of the wall between the US and Mexico at some point. I think that could be helpful too, because if any of you have seen that wall, there's space in between each metal bar, but you can't go past it. You can only reach an arm through. So how do these walls feel, or these images feel?
Painful.
Painful, oppressive.
Sad and lonely.
Yeah. Good.
I guess I feel the same about the Berlin Wall. The brick wall makes me think of in Wichita, the area of town, the old town that has a lot of brick buildings and the history there, or the old chimney in my house. So it's not as frightening or anything, but it reminds me that there's a history.
Yeah, I love exposed brick. So to me, that's that part of this slide is not oppressive. What about this fence? You can see through it. You could probably step over it. There's flowers. There's grass on either side. What feelings does this image evoke?
Makes me wish for spring.
I was going to say hope. Yeah.
Definitely not the oppressive or separation or fear that comes with the previous wall or fence.
Without forcing the message too much, and I already alluded to it, this fence, for me and for the purposes of this exercise, I think help illustrate what healthy boundaries can be in church settings. So we know where the boundaries are. We can see through them. It's not a brick wall. It's not a metal wall. It's something that's a little bit more flexible. And it can help us be better neighbors and better church members with one another. So boundaries are a gift. Marie Fortune, who founded Faith Trust, has the first quote. You can read that one yourself. I will read the second one, which I really like. One of the difficulties in ministry is that we misunderstand boundary setting with not being nice. People believe boundary setting is a rude experience. Why is this? In your experiences, either working with youth or explaining to other adults in your church why they need to have boundaries with youth, why does that sometimes feel rude or like you're being rude?
From my experience, I think it has been the person who's receiving it perhaps has been involved with, teaching and has a good record of that, and they feel like changing their past behaviors or, how they've been feels somehow like a accusation that they could be doing something wrong, or just feels offensive in, I've always done this and I've never, that's how I connect with kids. That's how I've done it. And so that's been some of the pushback that I've experienced.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious what you've done to get past that or address that kind of pushback.
Yeah, just trying to encourage and frame things as much as possible in an affirming setting, like even, talking through, for this particular situation that I'm thinking of, it has to do with taking youth to celebrate, they drive them to the donut shop to celebrate birthdays. And so, finding ways then to affirm the way that they're celebrating with the youth, these are junior high youth, and encouraging that kind of relationship building, and just helping them to think about, what are some of the things you can put in place to make sure that that continues to be, a place that's safe for both you and for the youth. But also I think it's been helpful for me to try to encourage that we are wanting to also be careful so that we aren't appearing to others, even if it is an innocent and a good intention, that we're not making the appearance to anyone else that there would be anything happening, and protecting ourselves from if there would be a false accusation.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And that is a helpful way. I mean, my earlier slide that was saying false accusations don't happen that often, that doesn't mean that we can't use that as a reason for protection policies and background checks and the 2-adult rule and all of that good stuff. That you can frame that for the volunteer as, hey, this also keeps you safe. Anybody else on either a time that rudeness has been involved in the whole boundary setting process?
I mean, I would think the first thing that comes to mind is people don't like to be told that they're doing something wrong, or that you're restricting what they're doing.
Yep.
In general. And especially in that sense of, well, we've always done this, or that's what I've done in the past. Or sometimes it seems like a veiled accusation, I guess, is the other piece. Some might think that you're actually saying, I think you're doing bad things, by saying, I want you to put a boundary there. And yeah, talking about, it's for everybody's protection or for everybody's safety, sometimes helps, but still, I think there's a level of, I don't know, feeling of accusation.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point.
And I even remember once when I was doing a protection policy, whatever, like a meeting, calling a protection meeting, it was like a mandatory attendance. And even that word mandatory, I mean, that like bristled hairs on people. Like, what do you mean? Like, you're forcing me to come? Anything forced me to, I'm an adult. And I'm just, that's a hard one to say. Can you also read Naomi's chats, Anna?
No.
Okay, then I'll read it for you. She said, it can also feel like a rejection, like you are being forced to reject the child. In reality, modeling boundaries with children helps them understand what positive relationships are, so they can be more aware of others who cross those boundaries.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
I like that a lot. Yeah, and the particularly clingy children or youth that want to be hugging a lot, I think they're often the ones that really need help with boundary setting, and not in a patronizing way, but in a way that helps them understand, what Naomi just said.
Mm-hmm.
That other adults may be taking advantage of that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, boundary crossing or boundary violation. Have any of you heard this sort of framework before? It was new to me, and I really like it. So boundary crossings happen all the time. It would be even when we shake hands with one another or greet one another, any kind of personal or even semi-personal question is technically a boundary crossing in this framework. What we want to avoid would be boundary violations, which would be not in the best interest of the other and resulting in harm. So the example that Faith Trust had was kind of a strange one with a clergy person visiting a church member in the hospital. Anyway, I didn't like it, and I didn't think it was pertained to what we're talking about. So I came up with this one. So boundary crossing would be asking a youth or a teen about how school's going, and that shows care and interest, and the youth feels respected and supported. Now, granted, there's lots of things that could go wrong. Maybe that child feels like you're being nosy or failed a class or doesn't want to talk about it, whatever. But you're asking about school in an appropriate way, and you're trying to show care and interest. A violation example would be commenting about their physical appearance or inquiring about a romantic relationship. And the use that I came up with, there could be multiple, but one that may be an adult's intention, still not good, would just be to be treating that youth as a peer and maybe joking around with them the way that they would a peer, although that could still be inappropriate. And the result is that at the very least, the youth would feel uncomfortable and maybe feel violated. Are there any other examples of crossings versus violations? Is this a helpful way of thinking about it? When I talked about this with a Mennonite church in Ohio during their adult Sunday school forum, it was so interesting because one of the gentlemen brought up another man in the church who likes to joke around with the high school girls. And he was defending him. He said, I think a lot of people would think that what he's doing is a boundary violation, but really he's just trying to get to know the girls, and he doesn't mean to make them feel uncomfortable. In fact, I think that they actually enjoy relating to him that way because he breaks the ice. Breaks the ice is kind of the excuse that was given. And the pastor and a slew of other people in the conversation piped up immediately and said, no, these girls do not like it. They've told us they feel uncomfortable. This is a violation. It doesn't matter that he's trying to break the ice. He shouldn't be doing this. So I was blown away that this church, that these adults had such an open and honest conversation. And granted, he wasn't there, so that felt a little bit unfair. But they're dealing with this very issue in their church, and they are trying to figure out, how to talk to him about it, how to hear the girls and affirm them. And they're kind of in the midst of it right now. So it was interesting. We can come back to examples, but I think you all get the idea here. And if you're curious, I'm happy to send more materials from Faith Trust about crossings and violations. So along with that, Faith Trust talked a lot about power and vulnerability, but I'm going to focus on the power piece since we're the adults and not the teens or youth. So power is relational. The youth leader may have more power than their youth, but less power than the lead pastor. Contextual, depending on the context and the setting. Power is also about resources, what we have or don't have materially, psychologically, or socially. And finally, it's neutral. It's not good or bad. It can be really good. It can be really bad. So I think it's important for those of us working with children and youth just to be really aware of the kind of power that we have because of our education, maybe just our physical size, our work experience, what we know. We all maybe feel like we don't know that much more than youth, but we do have knowledge and experience that they don't have. And all of those things give us more power than them and can create power imbalances, which also relate to boundary crossings and boundary violations. Have any of you taken a Safe Sanctuaries training with Marlene Bogard? Okay. She's done a lot of those in Western District Conference, and I know she focuses a lot on appropriate touch. So this material is credited to her, and I think it's simple but profound. So we've got good touch, which makes the person receiving the touch feel affirmed and received as warm, nurturing, caring, and supportive. So touch is not necessarily bad. There's very good touch. In church settings, it's best if that happens in public spaces and so that someone else is seeing what's going on. Bad touch, we all know the definition of that. The really tricky part is what feels bad to some people could feel good to others. You know, it's very complicated. And that's where confusing touch comes in. And something Marlene has said is that for teens, especially with everything that's going on in their own lives, either at school or at home, in their relationships and their friendships, with puberty, there are changes going on in their lives, a lot of touch probably feels confusing to them. So it's important to keep that in mind. We don't know what's going through their head. She talked about 8 years ago, she gave a presentation similar to this at a Mennonite camp and talked about the side hug, which has become kind of a joke, right? I see Clayton smiling or nodding. So, and she said that people really kind of scoffed, oh, side hugs, that's dumb. And now she either knows this or they told her or somehow found out that is really sort of the accepted norm. Is that side hugs are what this camp is now promoting. And so there has been a real cultural shift in terms of touch. And I don't think youth groups would be as quick to say, oh, we're just a touchy, huggy group as they may have been in the past. And I've reflected on my own experience in youth group and just kind of thinking about how things are framed differently now. So intentions are irrelevant. And I think this is helpful in all kinds of parts of life beyond touch, but it's often has to do what we said, what we have to say too. Like, I didn't mean for that to sound racist or sexist or whatever, but if the recipient feels that way, that is what matters. And so whether a touch is good or bad or confusing is determined how the receiver experiences it. And that may be based on the experience they had that morning, if they were hit by a parent or if they were violated by a boyfriend or girlfriend, not by your intentions. So I've alluded to some of these already. Okay, let's pause for a second with the transportation issue, because I think this is such a huge one. Have any of your churches, and I also want to learn from you all, have any of your churches talked about what to do with car rides and getting kids where they need to be, and how to not have that be one adult, one child? Are there any creative workarounds or any policies that you have?
I was just speaking with some sponsors about this last night, mainly because it's something that they're aware of, and we were trying to brainstorm some ways in which we could deal with it. And we're also in the process of revising our child safety policy and considering whether we want to include a piece about transportation for junior high and high school youth in particular. and we don't have anything on paper yet, but talking about making sure that there are always at least 3 people in the vehicle, that it's never one adult and one youth.
Good.
And because there are a limited number of drivers, and sometimes
no kidding.
Yeah, youth provide transportation to other youth. So how can you monitor if youth are providing transportation to other youth, who's riding with whom? And so we talked about, if that's happening, that you all meet at church and you're caravanning together and you know how many people are in the car and that sort of thing. You're just not having the youth sponsors attended youth group at this congregation. They said, we used to have this policy where seniors would go pick up freshmen, and that's just what was done. And there's like, it's not something we should do now. It's not a practice we want to have. And so that was a concern that they were raising, is how to best handle transportation. So that's something that we're working at. And I told them to draft something. I only talked with half of the youth sponsors, so draft something that we'll consider to put into our revised child safety policy, and that they could share with parents, and lay out some guidelines for parents, especially looking into the fall, about how transportation will be handled.
That's excellent. The 2 adult rule would be that there's always 2 adults with children. What you named about, if that can't happen, it's better to have 1 adult with 2 children than ever to have 1 adult and one adult and 1 child. So that's a good workaround. I think the transportation issue is one of the toughest ones, and even if you have, like, the strictest policy would be very difficult to follow all of the time. So I think there are creative ways of using technology to work for us. For example, having children text their parents when they left and when they arrived. So there's that kind of log of, oh, we didn't stop here for 30 minutes and no one really knew. My mom's a mentor at her church, and she's required to keep a written log of everything that they do and where they went. And I asked her, I just wanted to kind of test her just to see what she would say, oh, do you think that's a pain? And she said, no, not at all. Actually, it's helpful for me to have a list of what we've done. She didn't find it threatening. So that was helpful. But the mentor-mentee is a really sort of high trust, high risk piece of ministry. It's also so incredibly important, and there's so many kids that benefit so much from it. So I guess we're sort of holding those 2 things at once. I've talked about activities and touch in particular being observable and interruptible. Education on boundaries. I would encourage you all to, if you ever have the opportunity to talk about healthy boundaries, and even using the images that I used in those slides with the rest of your church, it can be a really wonderful discussion for adults to just think about how we treat each other and what kind of healthy boundaries we want to have. All right, let's skip the first question, but what are other ways rather than touch to convey care for teens? I think going back to one of my first slides about attentive listening and just hearing that child and asking good questions can be one.
I mean, I find too, remembering those conversations and bringing them up again later is a huge piece, because it shows the care that's not just in the moment, but it's care that's continuing. And yeah, that has much more of an effect, I'd say, than most other things that I do.
I like that. Oh, you remember what I was up to. That goes a long way. Yeah. Okay, I mentioned this earlier, but I do think you all have a role in modeling boundaries for the rest of the church. So things like letting children and youth, for that matter, initiate physical affection. I think we could all benefit from the first one a little bit more, and sort of asking before a hug. And I know this is hard because some churches, everyone hugs, and that's really normal. And then for others, that's not normal, or for other people within that church, they don't love it. So just maybe being a little bit more honest about how not everybody wants to be hugged. I've already talked about the side hug example. Yeah, and then we talked about using these guidelines also protect you. So having boundaries, going through the background checks, being screened, trainings are all things that protect you as the volunteer. Okay. Social media and technology. This one feels almost silly to talk about because I don't think any of us can keep up with the craziness of what kind of apps and things that teens are using, and it's constantly changing. And it's so helpful. I mean, I can't imagine church life without a listserv and without a Facebook page and without being able to text my pastors, for example. So I think electronic communication creates a unique challenge and an opportunity, as Christy and Cheryl say in their document on our website, which is what these slides are from. So they just gave some basic guidelines to consider, which I liked, which is thinking about limiting one-on-one electronic communication. So as much as I like texting, I think it creates that kind of one-on-one, private, perhaps intimate conversation that may or may not be appropriate. It's important if communication is traceable, which once again protects you. I've also heard of churches requiring that the parents be copied on any kind of communication. And then consider friending. I know of camps and of churches that have policies, well, I guess schools more than churches, but camps and schools, policies of teachers not friending students until they've graduated or things like that. So what kind of social media, if any, or technology guidelines does your church have? Anybody?
We don't have any, and that's part of the reason we need to revise our policy. Mm-hmm. As I was reading through it, and I've been at my church for a year, as I was reading through it, there was stuff about internet, but the policy had lapsed, and social media is completely different now, and we don't have anything in our policy about social media. And so that's something that's of interest to me, because that is a primary way that our sponsors connect with our youth, and trying to always figure out the best communication methods for the entire group is always interesting. And so what works well for one youth doesn't necessarily work well for another. So what sort of boundaries do you place in those sorts of situations? So I think that's a big gap. And in terms of my working with kids before, when I worked in the school system, it was, again, there's no friending pieces that, if a student friended me, even I had to decline.
Okay, so that was a policy at your school.
That was a policy, and even after I finished at the school, it took a little bit for me to be okay to accept friend requests. That was just something that I was aware of, and I even, as a pastor, don't request friends from the congregation. I'll accept friend requests, but I won't go out and friend people from my church.
I like that. I think that's great.
Yeah. So I want the initiative to come from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my church's policy that we're also working on revising, it was like World Wide Web stuff, and it was written when families all had one email address and things like that before. Yeah, 10-year-olds had smartphones and things. So there's just a lot to work with. Do you have any thoughts, Rachel, on this topic?
My goodness, I wish we had more. more guidelines. I actually just got an email last week from someone in Iowa who was working at a school, just sort of even their high school, Iowa Mennonite High School, was kind of is in the midst of this kind of question of like, how do we even for our students talk about social media and, appropriate boundaries and what that means. And yeah, so I think it's hard when you're sort of in the midst of the swamp. You haven't, sort of things are not super clear, but how do we take that next right step?
And I don't even mention cyberbullying in here because that seems a bit beyond our scope, but it does have to do with safety. And we have, Dove's Nest does have one speaker who talks a lot about cyberbullying, if that's something you're interested in, because that's a whole other piece of this.
We don't have a policy at our church, but sadly need to on social media. But I think one of the things that I have read recently that was helpful as I think about it is just a recommendation that using social media for communication only and leave relationship building for one-on-one, or not one-on-one necessarily, but for in-person interaction. Mm-hmm. Yeah, rather than, I think there is a difference there between just communication with everyone and then working at building relationship with folks in a different way. That's helpful.
I like that.
Yeah.
Actually,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go, please.
Oh, I was just going to say that this is definitely an area of struggle, I think, for me and us here, in that not so much social media, but definitely through texting is just the most accessible way of communicating. And most of the time that's group text, just to say, this is what we're doing, this is where we're meeting. And I send the same thing to the youth as I do to the parents. And other areas of ministry also do that with parents specifically. But it's just, it seems by the time you create a policy, it's already outdated.
Yep.
And so it's been for us thinking about what are the best practices and what are the ways that we can connect and form meaningful relationships. And part of the reality is that with the youth is social media is a valid way that they see as relationship building. And it seems like a missed opportunity if we just have a blanket, don't do it. But also, thinking critically about what our choices will be, and not waiting for something to happen to make those choices. Talking about it proactively has been really important. And also, I found that there's a lot of older folks on Facebook and Instagram that are following what the youth are doing through social media, and it helps them to feel connected to the youth in a way that they didn't. And that they come to me and say, hey, it was really good to see that you were serving at MCC, or that you connected in this way. I remember when we did that as a youth group. And so it's a really positive connecting feature. And so I hesitate when policies get too rigid, although I do obviously see the need for them, but to develop those best practices and to be transparent as to why those exist and involve the youth in it as well, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I was just going to piggyback on that too, Clayton. Thanks for offering that hesitation. Because the case of the matter is what we consider regular attenders in our congregations right now is actually one time every 4 to 6 weeks. And so that's an interesting dynamic. And it could also mean that you have a completely different youth group, every time you meet. And so how does one actually work at forming personal relationships when, you don't actually see one another in person all that often throughout the course of the year? So how can social media aid in that? And yet there's also, pitfalls and hazards to consider too in the midst.
Well, a lot of following other people on Facebook can be public and traceable. I mean, private messaging might be something to steer people away from, but looking at pictures and liking them, I mean, that's a public and traceable thing. So I don't see that contradicting with what you could have in a policy. The expectations are different, though. I heard one pastor say the people at her church expect her to look at all of their photos, and they'll say things like, "Oh, you didn't see what I posted?" And she's like, "Oh my goodness. So now my job as a pastor is to be on Facebook half the day, knowing what people at my church are doing." So yeah, good stuff. All right. We'll move away from the social media talk, but we can come back to it at the very end if we have a little bit of time for questions. But this slide actually should maybe come in the beginning, just to acknowledge that there are victims and survivors among us, maybe here in this webinar group, definitely in our churches and in our youth groups. And so when we talk about these things, individuals may be triggered, and it's important to be there for them without putting them on the spot or breaking confidentiality, but acknowledging that before we do a training or discussion of any kind. And finally, the importance of reporting and remembering that you don't have to have evidence. You don't have to do your own kind of information gathering. In fact, you shouldn't do anything that even resembles an investigation, but when a child or youth discloses to you or you suspect something, to immediately call CPS or call the police. And your states would have different numbers, but there is a national hotline as well. Things that I'm sure you all already know. These are things that sound simple in theory, and then when you're actually doing them are incredibly hard. So this final slide just has a little bit of information about Dove's Nest. We will be doing some stuff at Orlando, so stay tuned for that. And we have a monthly newsletter. If you want to sign up for that, just let me know. We've got lots of resources on our website. So where are we at time-wise, Rachel? What should we do next?
We have about 5 minutes. I think we could offer open it up for a few questions and then
Perfect.
Some words. Great.
Any questions related back to the questions that I posed throughout, or something that you just want to bring to the group?
And you could also, Anna, stop your screen share so we can see you, or you could see us in big.
Oh, that'd be great.
There you go.
That's too bad you can't see the screen and the video.
I think we could see you in a little.
Oh, okay, good. I could see some of you, but not the whole. Okay. Any questions or final comments? Did Naomi have anything else?
She just said, hello, Anna. I am the program director at Camp Friedenswald, and I'm finding this video training very helpful. Would Dove's Nest consider making a video training specifically aimed at summer staff orientations?
Yes, we would. We have a camp page with about 4 or 5 camp safety resources on our website now, but we don't currently have a training like this. I would love to partner with someone like you or others who work at camp settings for the content, because you would know much more about the current challenges than I do.
That would be awesome.
Good. Yeah, I can be in touch with Naomi. Well, I just want to thank you all for coming and realizing the role that you all play and how important that is in keeping kids safe. And you are not deniers. I think you all know that this is an issue, a problem, an epidemic, as some people have called it. And we want church to be the safest place. So we believe that can be possible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your work, Anna, and the work that Dove's Nest does on behalf of so many people. We're extremely grateful. So Yeah, strength and peace and blessings to you as you continue with that. And thank you to the rest of you for joining here in this important conversation. So hope it doesn't stop here, but you continue to take that back into your own circles of influence to continue this conversation. So until next time, take care. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.